for Giannini, who awakens my less developed parts and offers me a chance to struggle for a fuller self. Would you please warmly welcome Giannini?
Well, Peter, I'll give you more of an ample opportunity to appreciate my side of things, and it's terribly prejudiced, but here it goes. Figure 1. My goal in this lecture is to help us understand a typological polar reality in society as well as in individuals. The opposites are, on one hand, the dominant culture made up of extroverted thinking, ET in the center, as it were, of an extroverted sensate thinking, judging makeup, that is ESTJ. And on the other hand, a typological counterculture with its center, introverted feeling, IF, in the larger configuration, introverted, intuitive, feeling, perceptive, the INFP. These configurations will be referred to at times as ET, not extraterrestrial, and ESTJ on one hand, and IF and INFP on the other. Now, for those of you who don't know, the N is used for intuition because the I is already reserved for introversion. I'm not trying to discuss comprehensively the feeling function, for example, as Jim Hillman has done so creatively in the book Jung's Typology. Rather, I seek to show how IF and its allies in the INFP configuration function in specific individuals as walking and breathing shadows of our culture, and in each of us as often ignored shadowy aspects of our own psyche. Now, my personal shadow and madness is here. I test INFP, but I'm definitely extroverted, but for 35 years I desperately tried to live out the norms of our dominant culture until I began analysis with Victor White in a second breakdown. So this typological stuff is extraordinarily important in my life. I had a dream in which I go into the House of Studies office. I was in the Dominican order at that time, presumably to do some work, and I open a file drawer, and there is a great red heart among a bunch of valentines. And I'm looking deeply and ardently at that heart when Brother R walks in with his material and demanding that I file his stuff away. And Brother R was a totally head-oriented ESTJ type, so much so that we often wondered when on earth the man went to the toilet. That was my persona, okay? And desperately needing to find that shadowy aspect, which indeed turns out to be my true orientation. Jung's typology in general seems to be shadowy among most analysts. It seems to be mostly ignored as a pragmatic analytic tool. Now, dealing with this issue is beyond the scope of this talk. I personally find typology contributes substantially to understanding and assisting in individuation, conflict resolution, and vocational decisions, as well as understanding historical aspects and developments of our culture. Meanwhile, folks are not waiting for Jungians to come around. Myers-Briggs, who give us these formulations based on Jung's psychology, reported over 2 million people taking their survey in 1989. Now, I have included, please, number 1. Yes. I have included Jung's personal typology here, INTJ, not only to show specifically how he would be characterized by Myers-Briggs, but also to demonstrate to those of you who know your type that you can determine how you fit into these two fundamental cultural polarities. Notice that Jung shares the introverted intuition, the IN, with the counterculture, and TJ, thinking, judging, with the dominant culture. So even typologically, he balances the opposites. Before I continue further, I want to read to you a poem that gives us the feel of this important polarity. The poem is by Rumi, a 13th century poet from the Near East. Now, we're seeking to play here with types, so allow yourself to experience, to feel as the poem speaks of, the intellectual in the poem, as extroverted thinking, and the lover as introverted feeling in your souls. An intellectual is all the time showing off. Lovers dissolve and become bewildered. Intellectuals try not to drown, while the whole purpose of love is drowning. Intellectuals invent ways to rest and then lie down in those beds. Lovers feel ashamed of comforting ideas. You've seen a glob of oil on water. That's how a lover sits with the intellectuals, there, but alone in a circle of himself or herself. Some intellectual tries to give sound advice to a lover. All he hears back is, I love you, I love you. Love is musk, don't deny it when you smell the scent. Love is a tree, lovers, the shade of the long branches. To the intellectual mind, a child must learn to grow up and be an adult. In the station of love, you see old men and old women getting younger and younger. Now, I hope by the end of this talk that the original feeling of this poem will still be with you, and that you recognize that these are both aspects of yourself. I need to develop and share with you three aspects of this topic. In the first part, brief and introductory, I will show Jung's view from his book, Psychological Types, that our Western culture is mainly extroverted, sensate, and thinking. That is, outer-oriented, concretistic, and intellectual. I urge each of you to study this book, relatively ignored, because in my view it is one of Jung's most powerful critiques of our culture. Here he gives another answer to the problem of evil, the evil of one-sidedness, which he calls barbarism. In the second part, I will discuss my discovery in the analytical hours of a group of people, sometimes a third of my practice, who are INFPs and who share similar wounds, difficulties, and gold in dark places. I will use elements of our poem to discuss various aspects of this makeup as this kind of person struggles with the dominant culture. And please remember that dominant culture is always inside of us also. In the third part, I will outline the bare bones of the Psyche-Eros myth, this ancient story, at least 2,000 years old, that in my opinion registers the sufferings and triumphs of an INFP in the person of Psyche. This story enables all of us to enter into this journey of renewed inner self-valuing, as well as an integral and new realization of one's own ESTJ power. So here we'll find a cultural shadow working on its shadow. Okay, this gets convoluted, but true. Part one. Jung's typological understanding of our Western culture. Jung's book, Psychological Types, is not only a penetrating analysis of our culture, but another way of formulating our path to individuation. So the first English edition had the subtitle, The Psychology of Individuation. No wonder, given these two large aspects of the book, that is, the culture and individuation, that Jung complained in a 1934 forward to the Argentine edition that people were using the book, quote, to stick labels on people at first sight, unquote, by going to his chapter 10 too quickly, where he describes systematically the various types. This facile use of the book by so many could be one reason why it has been ignored by Jungians. Rather, chapters 1, 2, and 5 in general, and many others in particular, give us Jung's complex typological picture of our culture, beginning with what he calls the classical and medieval periods in Christianity. He shows how Western religion became quickly too outer, factual, and intellectual in both its dogmas and religious practices, beginning with the unconscious fantasies of the founder, Jesus, so that, quote, the forms welling up from his unconscious are declared to be universally valid and thus replace the individual fantasies of others, unquote. Rather, says Jung, Jesus sought to awaken the kingdom of heaven, that is, the potential for self-realization in each of us, so that he declares in John, ye shall be like gods. Instead, the idiosyncratic and unique religious insights that emerged from the unconscious were declared works of the devil by church authorities. Jung reports one amusing incident in which a monk, in dialogue with the devil, an early act of imagination, said, and this is a quote, "How does it happen that whilst thou hast been a liar on every other occasion, at this present the truth is spoken by thee?" How often do we encounter our shadow as our version of the devil, usually projected on others as distortions and downright lies? And when we face the demon, we realize a painful but growth-promoting truth about ourselves. Beware, therefore, Jung says, of one-sidedness in our souls. Jung sees any one-sidedness, specifically our cultural one-sided extroversion, with its tendencies to both concretize in sensation and intellectualize in thinking, as barbarism. And he contrasts this state with the philosophy of the Upanishads, the Hindu scriptures. In fact, he writes even angrily, it seems, "Our Western superciliousness," meaning arrogance, "in the face of these Indian insights is a mark of our barbaric nature, which has not the remotest inkling of their extraordinary depth and astonishing psychological accuracy. We are still so uneducated that we actually need laws from without and a taskmaster or father above to show us what is good and the right thing to do. None of us," Jung continues, "can individuate without facing the beast or shadow within. This cannot occur unless we deal with the conflict of opposites," as he writes, in our case here, the typological polarities. Jung specifically discusses the interplay of intellect and feeling. He acknowledges that to say, as does Goethe's Faust, that feeling is all, is just as pathological as to say intellect is all. And this is in paragraph 85. Jung holds in this same chapter that our Western science, because of its natural need to standardize and generalize, cannot deal with feeling, fantasy, and the unconscious. Further, because both Freud and Adler sought to emulate the physical sciences, neither could handle the healing creative fantasy and the unconscious out of which such fantasy comes. Jung elaborates in both chapters 2 and 5 how such a playful and childlike creative fantasy is the bridge, the mother pregnant with child source that unites all opposites and internalizes the outer world's seductive, baffling, and powerful hold on us. Alcoholics can recognize those three adjectives, so that we come to claim our own godlike powers. All right, part 2, and let's show figure 2 now, please. The ESTJ and IF polarity in individuals. Now, I must assume that most of you have some general knowledge of the types. However, I feel responsible to give a short description of them. The introvert-extrovert spectrum, the upper one, stands for the general orientation of psyche, respectively as, on the left, quiet and inward relative the self, the introvert, or as aggressive and outward relative the object, the extrovert. The intuitive sensate spectrum is called the perceptive, or knowledge gathering, through respectively the inner imagination, intuitive, or the outer five senses, sensate. The feeling-thinking spectrum is called judging or decision-making, either through logical and systemic thought, thinking, or through emotional, relational valuing, feeling. The last spectrum, judging and perceptive, needs further explanations because these have been added by Myers-Briggs on the basis of their worldwide research. Their research showed consistently that individuals always choose one entire spectrum over the other. That is more, let's say, of the judging FT, feeling and thinking, over the perceiving, intuitive, sensate spectrum, or vice versa. And the same research began to see specific characteristics attaching to each one, thus with judging, seeking closure and well-organized, and perceptive, open-ended, and disorganized. I began in my early practice to notice the difficulties that introverts were having in our society, no matter what their accompanying functions were. One such client reported an incident as a 12-year-old boy. He liked closing the door of his bedroom so that, in his typical mildly depressive state in which he felt at home, he could be present, as he puts it, to his inner sad poet and write poetry, or simply be alone. His father, a high-flying extrovert, once flung open his door shouting, "Keep your door open, this is no goddamn hotel." This problem with such an extroverted aggressiveness continued in childhood, needless to say, and was demonstrated when he dreamt, while in analysis, of being in the warm, sensual embrace of a woman, and guess what? Suddenly, father walks in. After surveying types for a couple of years, I began to realize I was getting, as clients, this substantial number of INFP types, as I have already indicated, showing, of course, how and to what extent my own person needed healing. As I pursued my dual cultural problem, which stemmed from the fact that as a child I spoke only Italian, and so that my first year in school was very traumatic. Then I read of a series of researches on right and left brain characteristics, beginning with the Jungian Ernest Rossi, tying the INFP combo to the right brain and the left side, and the ESTJ to the left brain and the right side, and that's why I've indicated these up there the way they are. To be on the left side, as in our figure, is to be sinistra, that is Latin for left, and thus sinister. The evil goats of Matthew 25, according to Jung. And the righteous sheep are on the right. Now, all of this is not of any comfort to INFP types. However, they're not surprised, having already in our contemporary society experienced themselves as inferiors. Moreover, they have learned that our dominant left brain culture is composed too often of wolves in sheep's clothing. Now, please turn to figure 3, and this is the most technical part of this, and I apologize, but this is the technical aspects of Jung's psychology. But it's important to do this, even if briefly, because of its tie with the Psyche-Eros myth later on. The research showed that if one is a judging type, as in the ESTJ, look at the J, you always start there. One extroverts his favored judging type. Recall that judging is made up of thinking and feeling. In this case, the T is extroverted. Now, this is strictly based on research, okay? Another way of getting patterns in our human experience. So you see the arrow from J to T. And since this family is also extroverted, thus the arrow from E to T, then extroverted T, thinking, is the dominant function of this type family and of our dominant culture. Now, if one is an introvert and belongs to, for example, the INFP family, the following is observed. That, again, you start with the P and the J. In this case, the P shows that this person now extroverts, always extroverts. The P function, that is, in this case, intuition. So the arrow from P to N. Now, however, because this person is also introverted, and since, and this is the key, an introvert never shows his or her real strength to the public and keeps it hidden, the hidden F, in this case, is the dominant function. And you see how, the jewel of the INFP F is exactly opposite to the jewel of the ESTJ. Now, I know that this is difficult to understand if you are being exposed to it for the first time, but I have no further time to pursue it here, maybe during the question period. Now, each of you might want to consider how this works in the case of Jung's typology, which is shown here also, his INTJ formulation. The Myers-Briggs structure perfectly supports the realization that Jung is an introverted, intuitive genius. Higher, please. Okay. Higher, higher. All of this, in my view, begins to show how interactive the types are with one another. Now, I began to explore another form of type interaction when I read in the spring 1978 issue of Psychological Perspectives, that's spring 1978, Psychological Perspectives, an article entitled Typology Revisited, A New Perspective, by Humphrey Osmond, a Jungian, and others. They maintain that while individual cognitive functions, such as sensate, intuition, feeling, thinking, give us much information about the dynamics of psyche within and without, they do not sufficiently delineate personality structures and substructures in the psyche. I began to play with this idea, as pictured now in Figure 4. The names of the couplings, as they show them as personalities, are shown directly under each couplet, and my equivalent name appears in parentheses under theirs, so that the ST structuralist is also the manager. The NT ethereal is also the creative scientist. The NF oceanic is also the creative artist. And the SF experial, and I've looked this word up in the Webster's Unabridged, apparently it's an invention, and it probably comes from experience, is also the moralist. Now, note the ST manager and the NF creative artist. When these are contained in the dominant cultures, ESTJ and INFP families, respectively, the manager and creative artist types are even more enforced. Now, the EST structure, you see, is the toughest, heady, masculine personality of all the 16 Myers-Briggs types. And the INFP structure is the most fluid, yes, oceanic, heart and gut-oriented, feminine, childlike personality. I believe that William James's division of human beings, as discussed by Jung in Chapter 8 of his type book, into tough-minded and tender-minded would fit perfectly the respective makeups of ESTJ and INFP. Later, when Bob Moore began to research and teach the 4 basic adult archetypes, I found the following correlations as seen, now please, Figure 5. Now again, I can't spend time here, but I want to show you what my journey's been like here. The NT creative scientist is the magician, and really perfectly developed in Bob's description of the magician. The SF moralist is the king or the queen. They direct the morality of the kingdom, of a company, of a family. The ST manager is the warrior, and the NF creative artist is the lover. Now, notice that those of you who have worked with these 4 archetypes, that they are in their proper oppositions, okay? According to Moore, the king and queen versus the magician or the medium, the warrior, or among women, Amazon, versus the lover. And this comes out of the type formulations, but it fits perfectly the oppositions that Bob Moore and his associate have been working on. Archetypes, this is the point, and types do meet in these couplings, the exploration of which, however, is beyond the scope of this talk, except to note again that here is reinforced the oppositional makeup of both the ESTJ and INFP, in which the ST warrior and the NF lover are respectively contained. All right, now let's consider some common dilemmas, responses, and characteristics of the INFP in contrast to the ESTJ, and some typical dreams illustrating each. Now, please do not think of these opposites in terms of other people, but let's think of them as dichotomies within ourselves. Let me draw from some aspects of our poem to give structure to this portion of the talk. The poem. An intellectual is all the time showing off. Lovers dissolve and become bewildered. ESTJs represent the top of our cultural heap, both in the general public and the leaders of our very aggressive, differentiated, and pragmatic society. It was this warrior leadership and public support that recently won the war in the Persian Gulf with high-tech efficiency and cruelty in destroying the enemy and minimizing our losses. There is still a blackout, however, on body counts and ecological damage according to international and Greenpeace sources. One day after the war ended, a high Allied commander, an Englishman, was asked by reporters about the body count. His reply was, "We are not here to deal with the pornography of war." Okay. The introverted feeling lover in us, hearing this in Rumi's words, dissolves and becomes bewildered. In the face of this hatred of the feminine sensitivity toward suffering, in the face of this cold-hearted but exceedingly practical view. Now here's an example, you see, of the goddess being castrated, as Nathan talked about last night. 44-year-old woman was gravely misunderstood and therefore mistreated from childhood because of her quiet, introverted, and poetically sensitive behavior. She dreamt that her mother, a strong, extroverted sensate, was lying in a coffin, quite dead. Mother lived totally on the outside of life, always in control, showing off, as the poet says. The dreamer sees herself as a 5-year-old girl standing nearby and letting, as the dream metaphor says, all her insides fall out between her little legs. Then the mother awakens, and the dreamer knows that she must be in servitude to mother for the rest of her life. Only when she lets go, you see, of her insides, her INFP integrity, does mother come alive. Now, she was living out the masochism, seeking it like a dark sponge, as Nathan has so eloquently noted. The INFP makeup is the most inside of all the families, not only because of its introverted orientation, but also because intuitives, which also means inner discipline, etymologically, know through the inwardness of imagination. It is also inside because feeling is characterized by a subjective rather than an objective view of another, by heart rather than head. Intellectuals easily fire people, for example, lovers do not. The pathology of thinking as cold-blooded is pitted against the pathology of feeling as bleeding heart. Balancing these yields the efficient yet humane person. The poem. Intellectuals try not to drown, while the whole purpose of love is drowning. The ESTJ amongst us and in us builds vehicles, buildings, or ships on the surface of the earth and its waters. The INFP, as oceanic, lives underwater and in the deep, wet valleys. A young male of this type, in his 20s, at the time of the dream, working in high finance, dreamt that he was looking at the Empire State Building, a symbol of men whom he knew and loved in big business, but sadly could not follow. Suddenly a great flood of water from the sky pours over the building, dissolving it until it sinks into a deep lake, at which moment, that is, when it entirely disappears, the dreamer buys the land and the lake and vows to build his own building from out of the depth. First, however, he knows he must live in that water. The poem. You've seen a glob of oil on water. That's how a lover sits with intellectuals, there, but alone in a circle of himself. An INFP woman dreams her ESTJ boss is charging around the office in her usual way, while she and an old, quiet man recognize one another as inward people. She adds, "We enjoy talking quietly, liking our company, and occasionally hugging." The Empire State Dreamer also dreamt that all members of his company, beginning with the president, were in a line in a stockyard. Now remember, he dealt with stocks and bonds. Stockyard. Going through an initiation in which each first leads a cow, the feminine, to slaughter. And then each in turn puts his head on a collar, and the person behind pulls a rope, causing a guillotine to cut across the neck. However, the neck remains intact. He realizes it is initiation. And each person walks off totally unaffected. However, when the feminine employee, just ahead of him, with whom the dreamer shares values, experiences the initiation, she arises, groggy, bloody in the face and left arm, and in deep psychological distress. He, seeing this feminine suffering, his own, says no to the initiation, and a few months later, no to the company. The poem. Some intellectual tries to give sound advice to a lover. All he hears back is, "I love you, I love you." A similar counterculture type, after experiencing several months of the tough-minded Midwest in her chosen field, and even some encounters with our own Jungian Institute, dreamt the following. I am on a hospital cot, lying down, fully dressed. A man comes up saying he is a sexual technician and begins to poke at different sexually sensitive points on my body. I am only slightly aroused. I finally say to him, "Why don't you undress me and make love to me?" I can hardly conceive of a more simple and creative way to capture the essential tragedy of our dominant culture, as it seems to totally misunderstand its walking type shadows, as it ignores the erotic, earthy sensitivities of this counterculture, and of course its counterpart in each one of us. In turn, that INFP part, like any inferior in society, clearly recognizes and sees the wounded condition of the dominant culture. The poem. To the intellectual mind, a child must learn to grow up and be an adult. In the station of love, you see old people growing younger and younger. Of course, the child must grow up and be an adult, must assume the responsibilities as well as rights of a mature, grown-up life. However, living only on the surface of things is not being grown up. One must outgrow and heal narcissistic wounds from childhood, but never abandon the new and creative child within. Our essential woundedness is the ignored creative and divine potential of the inner child, as Jung so powerfully develops in his article, The Psychology of the Child Archetype. Otherwise, we grow old before our time. A man at the beginning of analysis gives evidence in a dream of his aging, his killing workaholism. Teenagers are playing, talking, moving as he works. He orders them to be silent and still. One stirs, and the dreamer cuts him in two with a silver-handled machine gun. Needless to say, he awakens in horror. In a later dream, as a principal of a school, he not only learns how to handle the unruly, but also plays with and helps be creative the children under his care. He was also learning to play with dreams, which are primordial creative offsprings of the psyche. Now, overall, in concluding this part, we are learning from these living shadows that outer, showy, compulsive, and overly aggressive behavior seriously damages them as sensitive children and throttles their inner child's capacities. We are learning that the INFP's familiar, watery, feminine depth, as important as the masculine heights, is a rich source of intimate relating and fascinating inventiveness for each of us, that a quiet, peaceful demeanor has its own intrinsic value, even though the outer, fast world does not recognize it, and that the earthy, private ground of the INFP in each of us provides the necessary roots for another kind of outer ESTJ living that can modify our present overly loud, information-swamped, high-tech, and departmentalized society. This societal and inner counterculture also amply demonstrates that if its imperatives are not eventually obeyed, our world will be ecologically, effectively denuded, and humanly, morally bankrupt. Part 3, our shared journey, reclaiming our INFP roots and a new EST society within the Psyche-Eros myth. Now, many Jungians have interpreted this story: Eric Neumann, Robert Johnson, Nathan Schwartz-Salant, Jean Bolen. With a short time to work with, I want to give a typological version of this myth that both, in my view, affirms the INFP ground, and from that ground gives evidence of a new capacity to function in the world. The Psyche-Eros myth is a story of a young woman, Psyche, who is adored by the nations for her beauty. However, no one will marry her, and inwardly she is wretched. This is an archetypal picture of the typical sufferings of the kind of person we've been studying. It is also the picture of the suffering that goes on inside of each of us to the extent that we do not balance the inner with the outer world and assimilate the outer through symbols. The fact that Psyche is a feminine figure supports my view, so abundantly demonstrated over and over again in dreams, that the INFP type she embodies is the most feminine and childlike of all of the 16 types in the human experience. The great goddess of beauty and love, Aphrodite, is jealous that a mere mortal, Psyche, could usurp her place. Now, this jealousy must be read metaphorically as the self's attempt to lead Psyche out of a collective persona entrapment and into a journey of initiation. Have not many of us experienced a wrath of God dream because we were ignoring or were ignorant of a shadow demand, of a cutting edge of growth? Through the oracle of Delphi, Aphrodite tells the unhappy father of this wretched daughter that he must offer Psyche to the god of death, meaning Psyche must die to this distorted state in which she is adored only for her outer beauty, in which she is indeed a societal victim. Her son Eros, however, falls in love with Psyche and takes her to his castle in the wet, deep valley. Now, here is the crucial first movement necessary for her development from an extroverted to an introverted place, from the high place to the low, from desperate loneliness to an inner containment and love. The castle is a symbol of the self, capital S, as feminine container. It holds the images and treasures of the world, all of which belong potentially to Psyche. The castle is studded with gold, silver, and jewels, symbols of the valued self. Here she hears sublime music played by unseen musicians. And music, we are reminded by Jung, is the expression of the feeling function par excellence. This grounding INFP world is complete when Eros comes in total darkness, sleeps with her, and Psyche, enraptured by love, becomes pregnant. Psyche remains here, as the myth says, for a long time, as her parents grow old and feeble, grieving over their lost daughter. Psyche eventually becomes restless, wants to see her sisters even as they continue to look for her. The sisters' envy, curiosity, and questionings, when they finally come, leads Psyche to shine a lamp on Eros against his wishes. She loves him even more as she sees his beauty. But oil from the lamp falls on Eros' shoulder, and he awakens and leaves, wounded and grieving. Thus the necessary separation, the the differentiating that Nathan talked about last night, and that is particularly contained in that ESTJ makeup, which is, again, the most differentiated, hard-nosed aspects of our makeup. Now, this is occurring, and now Psyche continues her journey, our journey of individuation. Everything she does, always under the secret guidance of both Aphrodite and Eros, under the dynamics of the hidden self, aid her in moving from a grounded INFP to an evolving, integral ESTJ capacity. The climax of this work occurs in Aphrodite's castle as the angry and vengeful goddess tests Psyche in 4 ways. Now, I hold that these 4 trials perfectly describe the movement from an INFP to an ESTJ typology, giving ancient support, again, to these Jungian and Myers-Briggs formulations. Let's have number 3 again, please. The first trial fits this first appropriate movement of the INFP family. Notice that the P, again, the P here please lift it up, yes, means that this confrontation naturally extroverts intuition, or the N, Psyche's perceptive function. Again, see here the arrow from P to N. It is no accident, therefore, that Psyche's first test is to sort a jumbled pile of seeds before sunset. Now, every intuitive knows their equivalence of such a mess, such as just disorderly desks and private rooms, you name it. Or we clear our desk and we leave a mess in our drawers. We keep trying to convince others that we still know where everything is, right? Sorting is not easy. Yet in times of need, we muster our inner strength to do so. Ants, metaphors of efficient and endless effort, sent by Eros, come and do the sorting before the daylight passes. Daylight indicates here that this task is the most conscious of the 4. Now, this task has another meaning for INFPs, for this makeup in each of us, that is, that the intuitive mess symbolizes creative capacities, must be noted. Creativity, paradoxically, does not occur without chaos, or a certain form of madness. This group of people often display their talents quietly but impressively in every field of endeavor. And they often create under chaotic and adverse circumstances, such as the New Zealand poet and story writer Janet Frame, I know she's an INFP, who wrote poetry that won a national award in New Zealand while in a mental hospital, receiving over 200 electric shock treatments and almost being lobotomized. And she was diagnosed for 8 years as being clinically depressed. She was only shy and introverted. Now you can experience her story in the autobiographical movie, An Angel at My Table. How many of you have seen it? Oh, a great number of you. She also has an autobiography now available that really is the basis of that movie. The second trial is also most appropriate now that the most amorphous of the 4 aspects of the INFP is out of the way. Here Psyche is challenged to cross the river and go to the high country where sheep are standing enraged by the hot noonday sun. There she is to pick the golden fleece from their backs. Psyche, per usual, is ready to throw herself off the cliff into the river. It's fun falling. She had already done so once, and the waves had thrown her back out. That's true in the tale. In this test, Psyche is challenged to be assertive, that is, moved from introversion to extroversion. However, she must do it in an introverted way, in what I call a quiet extroversion. Going to that pasture at noontime, remember the movie High Noon, would surely have killed her. So the green reed of the river, as the myth says, nurse of sweet music, breathed on by some breath divine, counsels her to hide under a tree, and recall Rumi's love tree. Presumably it advises her to wait until dusk and then under moonlight, or at least when the sheep are lulled into sleep, that is, under the ambiance of introversion, she can pick the fleece from the thickets against which the sheep had rubbed themselves. An INFP, a highly accomplished harpist, was wretchedly shy of any public challenge, even on musical committees. He was once terrorized in a dream in which he is on the top floor of the Hancock building and it is swaying several feet. His redemption, his own intrinsic movement toward extroversion, began when he had a dream in which he is alongside a river. Now, this is the appropriate earthy, oceanic place, in contrast to the premature, highly extroverted place. He watches harpists playing on barges as they float from the left to the right. He especially notices one who is dressed in the flamboyant costume of a rock singer and is playing the harp not with his fingers but with the drumstick, usually reserved for use on a timpani drum. The dreamer spoke of the psychological distinction between drum and harp in an orchestra. The drum is the epitome of a masculine extroverted loudness, so typical, and the harp of an introverted feminine quietness. The extroversion here occurs in drumming, but with the psychic atmosphere, the gentler sound of the harp strings. Moonlight and darkness, or sleeping sheep in Psyche's case, and the harp sounds in this case are equivalent metaphorical conditions in which the introvert can and must authentically realize his or her quiet extroversion. The third trial leaves two typical challenges to go. Okay, we have two left. That is, from perceptive to judging, and from feeling to thinking. Now, since the centerpiece of the INFP and ESTJ families are respectively IF and ET, it is psychologically and dramatically appropriate that the challenge to move from feeling to thinking occur last. It seems as if this tale, so old, already knew these formulations. So in this third trial, Psyche is challenged to move from perceptive openness to judging containment. That is, she is given a goblet and is told to fill it with water from the great river Styx as it tumbles as a waterfall from a high cliff. Zeus sends an eagle who takes the goblet from Psyche's hand as she lies again despairing. In fact, she was ready to climb up the cliff and throw herself down. The eagle, avoiding the great protective dragons on the cliff, deftly fills the cup and brings it to Psyche. Her helper, now an eagle, in contrast to the earthbound ant or reed, signifies that Psyche is beginning to attain some masculine ESTJ heights. People constantly dream of containers, some of which are like sieves. Some hold and make possible a focused perception. Creativity cannot occur without limits, just as food cannot be cooked without a vessel, as a rule. The goblet provides the centering and containment in which transformations occur. Judging also reminds us that each of us, though an infinitely small part of life, in comparison to the entire human race and the universe, has a specific gift, a talent, some way of contributing finitely to the infinite whole. A young poet, David Whyte, puts it this way. White is spelled W-H-Y-T-E. Enough. These few words are enough. If not these words, this breath. If not this breath, this sitting here. Judging also reminds each of us that we can make decisions that synchronistically touch others, that in a microcosmic way, we are the whole. An INFP associate of mine dreams that he is standing alone in a vast stadium. First, he is at peace. Then he begins to realize with growing dread that he must make a decision. He finally takes a seat, and when he does, the stadium suddenly is entirely filled with people. Every seat is taken. The fourth trial is the most difficult for Psyche. is the most difficult for every strong feeling type. Psyche is asked to go into Hades, into the dark bowels of the earth, to obtain from Persephone a beauty ointment for Aphrodite. Psyche sees a tower and climbs it. Guess what? Ready to cast herself off, and thus enter Hades in death. However, the tower, now her own ego construct, speaks, counseling her that she can make it. However, she is not to give in to the requests of anyone on the way. The tower also gives her coins for the underground river Styx crossing, and cakes to feed the three-headed dog of Hades to and from the destination. She does so, even refusing to give help to a dead person rising from the river waters. And she uses the coins and cakes appropriately. When she returns to the surface of life, she decides to use some of the beauty ointment herself. When she opens the container, she finds there not ointment, but a sudden void, as the tale puts it, a hellish and truly Stygian sleep, which she falls into. However, Eros comes immediately and awakens her, asks Zeus for permission to marry Psyche. Psyche is made a goddess. They wed, and she gives birth to a daughter named Pleasure, or Joy. Now, any feeling type, especially introverted ones, can tell you the depth of this trial's challenge, to be able to say no when someone asks for help, or someone who's been a mother's helper, a family helper, and the helper of all humankind for all of one's life, without, however, taking care of his or her own needs. Psyche is helped on this journey not by nature's or the self's gifts, such as the ants and reeds, and the reed, and finally the eagle. Rather, she is helped by her own construct, her own consciousness, her own larger perspective and tougher resolve, all of which she is now developing, symbolized by the tower. The coins symbolize the pragmatics of life, that one must earn and pay one's way in our competitive world. But what about the cakes given to the three-headed dog? Before answering this, let me consider with you noting that this trip, instead of going to ET heights, goes into IF depths. She enters the earth and the province of the goddess, Persephone, who, like Psyche, in my view, is totally INFP. Paradoxically, by correspondence, as in the case of our second trial, in which extroversion is realized in an introverted context, she is to realize her extroverted thinking strengths within an IF ambiance. Finally, in this view, the cakes for the dog begin to make sense. Dogs, of all of our fellow creatures, are, as we say, man's best friend. They strikingly epitomize the feeling function, its endless need for warmth and intimacy. Even while we are developing our thinking function, we need to take care of our feeling needs that could become vicious if we ignore such a fundamental ground. Given the dog cakes, giving the dogs, or three-headed dog cakes, metaphorically meets this need. Further, Jung reminds us in his last writing before his death, in Man and the Symbols, that all the thinking, intellectualizing in the world about psyche, about symbols, will not help if we ignore, as he puts it, the value. Then he says, the emotional value, i.e., the feeling function of symbols. We cannot realize individuation and a growing connection with the self without introverted feeling. Now, I recommend that to you, the small book, page 8990. There is one final concern, which is critical to our journey: the beauty ointment that becomes the void. Most commentators consider this Psyche's mistake. Even Eros in the story thinks that her curiosity has almost brought her to destruction. However, the tale amply reminds us that Eros, representing often a one-sided masculinity, is mistaken about many things. He wants to keep Psyche completely in the dark, completely in his possession, never to see his sisters and family, never to be separated from him. But the experiential logic of this story has already required that Psyche die to her old life, in which she is appreciated only for her outer beauty. So she goes into the depth of the valley and the castle, and there is joined to an inner dark lover like death. Then she plunges again into the depths of the darkness of earth, now on her own volition, in the fourth trial. So in my view, this last darkness, this Stygian sleep, is not a disaster, but the final logic of psychic growth, Psyche's fullest realization of gold in dark places. That is, that we encounter the darkness of self, the imponderable mysteries of existence, the reality, as Eckhart puts it, of naked being, of Taoism's Tao that cannot be defined, of a formless ground of psyche that contains all the forms. Eckhart's naked being is for him the fullness of what it means to be childlike. So we are in touch again with Rumi, who remind us that lovers grow young rather than old. In my view, this final swoon enabled Psyche to experience her inner yet inexpressible beauty as one contemplates the mystery of existence itself. The overall story moves from outer beauty to an inner lover, then to a transcendent inner beauty, the final fulfillment of the INFP in each of us, and by virtue of this latter, Eros awakens her, and she realizes now an outer lover. She is pregnant and gives birth to the child, the joy of self, in which, in a way that only a mystical poet such as Meister Eckhart can express. He says, "I once had a dream. I dreamt that I, even though a man, was pregnant and full with nothingness, like a woman who is with child, and that out of this nothingness God was born." Thank you very much.
The floor is open for questions and comments. The break will be after we finish. Anybody have a question or a comment that they want to make?
Over here, Peter.
I think I infer correctly that Jung's shadow would be characterized by extroverted sensing, according to your models, and I wondered how you think it manifested itself in his life.
Well, he certainly wasn't interested in the details of life. Although, interestingly, his sensate, if you will, sensitivities were very much awake in his cultural loves, which we hear and read little about. His love for opera, for example, the few opportunities that he had to go to the opera, to go to the symphony. I don't think he was that much in touch with his body. I think this is the greatest problem. I think this is one of the shadow aspects of our Jungian work that we've already indicated, and I think that this is a cutting edge of our work together. To realize that body really is already an aspect of the unconscious, as well, of course, as consciousness as we use it in an aware kind of way. The evidences that we have of the correlation between psyche and mind are becoming so evident that we hardly need to discuss it here. But we do not pay too much attention to it yet. And that's happening. Marianne Woodman, in her work, for example, with people who are having weight problems or anorexia nervosa problems, is amply demonstrating the fruitfulness of working with body as well as with psyche at the same time. Definitely a shadow.
Other questions?
Yes, could you talk for a minute about the role of gender identification in the family as it relates to the struggle of the person who would identify with INFP as opposed to masculine roles or feminine roles as they develop within the family?
Well, everything that I have said in a large sense applies in the family. One of the extraordinary difficulties that I see over and over again in people I work with who are highly sensitive in this inner way. And again, please note that when we say inner, we're not just talking about introversion, we're also talking about imagination, which is inward. It's an inward way of knowing, and also feeling is a much more inward way of valuing and of choosing. So often the quiet child is not sufficiently appreciated. Okay? Now, here's an interesting thing, too. There's been research by the Myers-Briggs people showing a strong correlation between certain type families and high intelligence. Okay? And INFPs are very, very much up there in the realms of high intelligence. Now, what I have learned from gifted children and from those who work with gifted children is that that high intelligence is not just cognitive, and the tragedy is that this is the way the child is treated. That this child must perform, you see, on an intellectual level. Whereas what that intelligence means is that this young person has a high sensitivity on a felt level, on an intuitive level, on a bodily level. And that needs to be recognized, that needs to be contained. Okay, so this is one of the crucial aspects of this kind of, I think, understanding in the family. Now, the other, of course, is the extraordinary difficulty that some INFP types have with spouses who are just the opposite, and I work with quite a number of those. And the pain of it is immense. Like this one woman saying that in dealing with my husband, who's now has had a heart attack, and she says, I'm worried about him, he will not pay attention to his body. He acknowledges that he's cut off from it. If one can prove a cause and effect connection, then he will respond. For example, he was paddling his little girl quite severely until she pointed out that this child was also paddling her cats and dogs as severely. And when he saw that, then he was able to respond. But he has a very difficult time imagining, perceiving metaphorically. And this, of course, I consider one of the great tragedies of our society, because that metaphorical awareness enables us to corral so many projections, whether they're personal projections or whether they're cultural projections. And that we had better get into the business of working with this larger culture, which is constantly being affected on the outside by these inner happenings, these metaphorical happenings, which are real. What we're talking about all the way through here is psychic reality, which is just as real as societal and bodily reality. The three realities that Erik Erikson talks about. We've done a lot with the outer aspects of the body. We've done a lot with the outer aspects of society, but not with psychic reality, and therefore with the inner aspects of both body and society also. When we are in that INFP mode, we are not just private, we are also aware of the inwardness of nature, the inwardness of the other person and persons we are with. And the pain, you see, of the ESTJ and INFP people who are married is in the difficulty of recognizing the many subtle differences between the two. I hope that helps.
Other questions?
Here's
Can you comment on the correlation, if you know of one, between INFPs and victim of abuse? In other words, are more INFPs victims of child abuse?
Well, yes. From what I have experienced, again, we're in the same vein of the discussion, and that is that because the child is often so unappreciated, not understood, generally by the culture, and the culture influences the family so seriously. I have seen in my work now much evidence of child abuse, that is, of these very, very sensitive children. And again, their sensitivity itself, you see, already adds to the problem. Adds to the problem. There's a high feminine way of functioning in both little boys and girls, not just girls. Okay, we're talking about a reality here that goes beyond the genders. And what often happens is that there is an unconscious hatred of that kind of sensitivity by one parent or both parents. There's a fear of this dimension within themselves, and therefore, you see, projected onto the child, and therefore the abuse, which is often very, very strong psychologically, and at times very evidently physical and sexual.
Others?
Here's one over here, Peter.
In relationship to the INFP, I have a daughter who was an INFP growing up, very shy. The shyness was there. And
From the beginning.
From the beginning.
Yes, yes.
Oh, wait a minute. I should say real tiny. You know, maybe she wasn't so much.
Okay.
You know, when there were only the family people around that she was familiar with. But as soon as she had to face the world, became very introverted.
Yes, yes.
And in order to live in the world, she had to develop the E in order to exist and to make a career for herself.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because she couldn't, you know, unless she wanted to be, you know, a librarian, which she did not want to do. I suggested that, but she didn't want to do that.
Right.
So I think that, and I've seen that in others, you know, and my own clients, they have to develop that to live in our society, which happens to be an extroverted society.
Absolutely.
You have to do that, and I suppose, but that's an okay thing to do. And I mean, in other words, as long as you know that one belongs, that both of those things, the one belongs to you and the other is adapted.
That's the key, though, you see, and that's why that Psyche-Eros myth that I discovered quite, if you will, synchronistically, has been so powerful when I've done workshops throughout the country on this, what I call the typological counterculture. And that is that it gives us a map for what people need to do who are of this type. The point of the story is, again, that one needs to value one's ground. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that the culture does not provide that opportunity. And so it often has to happen in analysis, unfortunately just in analysis, but it can happen in families that are conscious of this kind of makeup. One must first be grounded. When one is grounded in one's introverted feeling and its allies, then one builds effectively a quiet extroversion, if you will, as well as a quiet sensate ability to marshal the facts that she needs in order to function in the world, to systematize it in a thinking way, and to give it its proper containment in the J, you see.
Those people have a hard time seeing the value of that introversion.
Exactly.
And that's the thing that's hard.
And that's the difficulty immediately in the classroom. You see, where these little kids are sitting in the back of the classroom, are very, very quiet, and the teacher does not know what to do with them because they don't fit the mold. You see, they do not fit the mold. And poignant story after poignant story has been told to me about the experiences of these people in the classroom.
I think we have time for two more questions.
Mine is not so much a question, but a statement, and it's mostly in regard to last night, although I think it's relevant to today, and if you may, I'd like to say it.
Go ahead.
I've written it out because I articulate better in writing. Language theorists tell us that language, which is symbolic representation, has the ability to form and perpetuate belief systems. Language takes on the nuances and meaning of a prevailing attitude or myth and becomes the carrier of that myth. When the language that represents the myth is repeated over centuries, it embeds deep within our psyche and becomes apparent truth. Language then can carry our shadow. To say this differently, our shadow continues to be an accomplice through the use of language symbols to carry myths that can be destructive, abusive, and oppressive. Let me be more specific. The gentleman who delivered the address last night repeatedly used references to mankind for humankind, male experiences as normative, and darkness for shadow. It is in the use of such words which hold shaping value, and here destructive value, to perpetuate the myth of white male superiority. This is a myth that we've lived with for centuries, and one which continues to shape and mold our understanding of ourselves. This kind of language, however removed it may appear from the arena of Jungian psychology, has the ability to carry the culture's destructive, evil side. The shadow side destroys connections, destroys relationship, and disallows for personal and cultural integration. This evil side continues to want to control, dominate, and subordinate people of different color and ethnic backgrounds and women. The African Americans have for centuries been the containers for white persons' evil and madness. White people have projected onto people of color and other ethnic backgrounds our sickness. The association of darkness to darky and black and its use for shadow is too close, and I don't believe a coincidence. It is destructive. I would like to invite the future participants to think seriously about their use of language, if not for their integration and growth, then to show sensitivity to the way language you use perpetuates a myth that long since needs exploding. One last point. I do not believe for a minute that men are superior to women. In fact, my suspicion is that men fear the reverse is true and have for centuries attempted to make women the containers for their evil and their sins. In other words, women have carried and accepted the projections of the men's shadow. Any woman or man, regardless of color, who continues to participate in the use of this kind of language continues to contribute to their own oppression and to the disassociation of their own shadow. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'll buy that. 99%.
I think we have another
because
comment.
I would also add, pardon please?
We have one other comment and then a question, and then we do have
I would also add that this kind of outlook not only injures women and people of other races, but also children and also sensitive men. That sensitive men are also equally victims. And of course, the greatest victim of all is the person who's in charge. And that is the tragedy of this all. Now, I still have difficulty, however, with this use of dark and light, because I don't think this has anything to do with races. Just like Nathan was pointing out last night, that we do deal with the reality of night and day. Okay, maybe we need to put it in those terms, and I appreciate what you're saying about sensitivity in regard to dark and light, especially black and white. Okay, that's a particularly difficult problem, and I can appreciate the sensitivity of this gentleman over here when he spoke last night. Okay, Peter.
Yeah, I would like to just make a comment. I feel offended when people give lectures instead of ask questions. I really think we have our lectures, and I'd appreciate listening to the lectures and having them respond to questions. Thank you.
Peter, over here, there's one more.
It's alive.
This is a question to express my ignorance. I thought you put a proper weight on culture, and I'm confused semantically because I understand the personal shadow that was talked about last night a great deal, and the collective shadow I sense is something more archetypal, but it seems to me that the area I work in has to do more with a public shadow. For example, in the Gulf War, we, as a people in the United States, celebrated that destructive event. Now, does anyone, or am I just confusing this issue?
I don't see any, let's say, difficulty between relating the personal and the transpersonal, as Nathan pointed out last night. They're really, you can make a distinction, but they're inseparable. The deepest aspects of the personal, paradoxically, is the transpersonal. And that's why you see a mythic structure such as the Psyche's journey, which is at least 2,500 years old, is of such value for us to give us a feel of the collective nature of this problem that so many individuals experience personally, but which evoke and really are representative of a large cultural problem, as this lady points out, that is thousands of years old. You know, and I certainly recommend that that all of you read the book, the Chalice and the Blade, that and other books like this that are giving us this larger perspective on this kind of cultural problem. And of course, this is no place for me to start talking about the Persian Gulf War because, as Peter indicates, I have strong opinions and I might shout all over the blessed place.
Believe it or not, this is exactly what we wanted to have happen. So,
what?
Let's take a coffee break.
You want me to start?
Come back at 10 minutes to 11, please, and we'll get started. Thanks, John.